Hello everyone and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Stopping CEO Fraud. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Lance Spitzner, Director, SANS Securing the Human, and Preston Ackerman, a supervisor with the FBI's Cybercrime Program. If during the webcast you have any questions for Lance or Preston, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But please be advised that the FBI will not comment on any ongoing cases or investigations. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Lance.
All right, Carol, thank you so much. Folks, thank you for joining us for CEO Fraud. My name is Lance Spitzner, and we're very excited to have you join us today. Carol did not mention we are recording this webcast, so the recording will be available afterwards. That way, in case you have to drop off at any point, or you think this is some great information a friend or coworker would like to know about, it will be recorded. So with that said, let's jump in and get started. First of all, what is this webcast about today? What are you going to learn? Well, first of all, we're going to say and confirm what CEO fraud is and why you should care. Then we're going to discuss common indicators and shared trends for these type of attacks. I'm really excited to have Preston join us because he's going to share with us several really interesting stories and trends the FBI and law enforcement are seeing. And then, and most importantly, I feel, how to defend against these attacks. What can we do to detect them and how best to respond to them. So as Carol mentioned, my name's Lance Spitzner. I'm the director at SANS Securing the Human, and I'll be doing the intro and first couple of slides of this webcast. But about slide 7, slide 8, we're going to hand this over to Preston because I feel like he's got the real interesting story here. In fact, what's really interesting is when I first started creating and preparing for this webcast, I was getting all sorts of information from all over the internet. And I kept bumping into the FBI. The FBI had all sorts of statistics, announcements, investigations, and things like that. And I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. We should have the FBI on here because they are the ones with all the information. So I was very excited to have Preston come on board and join us. Preston, if you like, just a moment, could you just briefly introduce yourself to the group here?
Yes, as Lance said, I'm a supervisor with the FBI's Cybercrimes Division. I've worked primarily in the United States, a little bit as well in Europe, and oversee some of our cyber investigations to include some business email compromise investigations. I also have a lot of very good friends at FBI headquarters and at the Internet Crime Complaint Center, which I'll mention a bit more, who I queried for information in support of this webcast.
All right, Preston, thanks so much. So like I said, Preston's going to be sharing all sorts of great stories and information here. But first of all, what I wanted to discuss is, what is CEO fraud? Or as Preston mentioned, it's also called business email compromise, BEC for short, or I've also seen it as business email scams, called BES. What is it? Basically, it's cyber criminals doing targeted attacks against your organization. Basically, it comes down to they do research on your organization, identify a senior executive, and then pretend to be that senior executive. Usually their goal, almost always, is money. Most of the attacks are wire transfer to fool an individual in the organization to transfer money. In some cases, what we're seeing a lot of in the United States is tax fraud, where instead of fooling somebody to send money, but maybe W-2 tax forms, so the bad guys can use the information for tax fraud. So that's what CEO fraud at the simplest level is. Now, why should we care? I mean, there's always some type of attack going on. Because this is effective. It is growing fast. Here are some interesting numbers I pulled from the FBI site. So basically what you're seeing, billions of dollars in losses. That's been what's been reported to the FBI. Got to kind of wonder what hasn't been reported to the FBI. And then this is the number that really stands out since January of last year, 270% increase in victims and loss. And this is global. So it's just not the United States, but very interesting, almost 80 countries. So why? Why is this so effective? Why is it growing so fast? Well, we know the bad guys. The bad guys go where the money is. So if there is a new trick in the trade where they can make a quick buck, they're going to go there. In CEO fraud, BEC, whatever you want to call it, it is very effective. It's very profitable. But why? First of all, technology really cannot defend against this attack. Think about it. Most phishing technologies, most perimeter defense technologies are all about finding bad links or bad attachments. There's no bad links. There's no bad attachments in these types of attacks. It's all about scamming people, fooling them, conning them into doing something they shouldn't do, i.e. a wire transfer, sending information, things like that. The second thing is the bad guys are starting to get good at these attacks. Remember APT, when that was all the rage, Advanced Persistent Threat? The whole idea that made that so dangerous is they did their research. They would identify specific individuals to target. Bad guys have picked up on that and now replicating the same attack method. They're doing their research. They're identifying specific targets. In other words, who's the senior leadership, CEO, CFO, things like that, and who has access to what they want. If it's wire transfers, then who's in accounts payable. The other thing is the stories they're telling are very good, as Preston will explain here in a little bit. They create compelling stories that create sense of urgency. They're playing on human emotion. No technology is going to be able to defend against that. Also, since these are legitimate organizations conducting legitimate wire transfers, quite often they're less suspicious to financial institutions. It can defeat things like banks' callback procedures. Once again, Preston will be talking a little bit more about this. So really, how does this work? Think about it. Bad guy researches your company. You probably have a lot of information on senior leadership or individuals at LinkedIn, your public website, Google, forums, things like that. The bad guys then identify, okay, who's the key leadership, and then they do a little deep dive on them. Harvest their LinkedIn accounts, maybe even ask, see if they can link into them, things like that. Then who's handling the money? Quite often accounts payable. Then they craft their message. They craft their attack, launch, and boom. They trick or fool people into sending or doing something they shouldn't do. And like I just showed you a couple slides ago, this is becoming very effective. Hundreds of organizations losing billions of dollars. You see it in the news every day. So to better understand and defend against these attacks, let's do a bit of a deeper dive on how the bad guys do this. So what I'm going to do now is turn this over to Preston. And what Preston's going to do is he's going to do a bit of a deeper dive and explain some of the different ways the FBI is seeing these bad guys doing these attacks, some of the different common scenarios. He's going to do deeper dives on these, and then what FBI recommends to counter these attacks. So Preston, what I'd like to do is hand this over to you and go into a bit of a deeper dive with your scenarios here.
Very good. Thanks, Lance. Before we launch into the scenarios, though, I wanted to talk just a bit more about the Internet Crime Complaint Center, even though many of you are probably familiar with it. The website is www.ic3.gov. That's the letter I, the letter C, the number 3. It was established to provide a single location where people could file a complaint with law enforcement regarding Internet crimes of all types. And one of the problems that many people had encountered with Internet frauds, particularly those with a small financial loss or even no financial loss, was that it was difficult to find law enforcement willing to investigate the crime. Let's think about it. If you're defrauded of $4,000 while trying to buy a used vehicle online, the global nature, as you mentioned, of Internet crimes causes a bit of an economic or resource problem for law enforcement, in that the financial loss likely does not justify the resources it would take to both investigate and prosecute the crime and probably extradite somebody. So for this reason, some have assumed law enforcement doesn't care about this type of crime. Well, I would like to dispel that myth for you. Law enforcement does care about these crimes, and that's where the Internet Crime Complaint Center, or IC3, comes in. It provides a forum where complaints can be entered for crimes of any financial loss, or even if the fraud was detected and no financial loss occurred. So IC3 receives on the order of 300,000 complaints per year, give or take, and that data can be aggregated, analyzed, sliced, diced, you name it. And it can be used to identify key Internet trends or to find commonalities out of the many smaller crimes, which can provide law enforcement a better target to investigate. So again, for example, one complaint of $8,000 is one thing, but if we can link 20 different similar complaints, it becomes obvious that a career criminal or an organized crime group worth investigating is likely behind those frauds. Now, as you mentioned with BEC, the losses are large also, but I give you all of that background on IC3 for a couple reasons. First, I do want all of you to know where to send people who are victims of these crimes, or if you unfortunately need to file a complaint yourself. And second, I want you to understand the data source for much of the best information regarding BEC frauds that's out there, and it's IC3, because they monitor all of these complaints to identify trends, and then they produce analytical products of those trends which are most important. So in the case of BEC, the Internet Crime Complaint Center has produced multiple public service announcements over the past couple years. And once they release these PSAs, security professionals then use that data to perform their own analysis for use in blog entries, white papers, newsletters, and the like. So during the past few years that the FBI has tracked CEO fraud, or BEC, victims have provided similar stories over and over again, such that the frauds can really be categorized into the 4 primary scenarios you see on the screen. This has been borne out also, I would add, by law enforcement partners in Europe and throughout the rest of the world as well. So I'm going to briefly cover each scenario. There are certain variations on each of these themes, but generally speaking, these cover the crime problem well. So let's go to the first one, working with foreign suppliers. The first, this targets businesses who work with a foreign supplier. Your business purchases goods from a supplier with whom you have an established relationship, and the goods are then shipped as expected. However, a fraudster sends an email to you requesting the payment be sent to a different location, typically a bank in China or Hong Kong. There's usually a simple story that the bank account is not working, or it's being audited, or something of that nature, and you dutifully redirect the payment to the new account, which is controlled by the criminal actor. This fraud is usually not discovered until the supplier contacts you for the missing payment, and often by this time it's too late to have a very high probability of recovering the funds. So the next one we want to cover is request for or the classic CEO fraud, It's probably the most common. The fraudster either hacks or spoofs an executive's email account. And on that point, let me just say quickly that although we use the term business email compromise to discuss all these frauds, most of these scenarios can potentially succeed either with an actual compromise or merely with spoofing. Compromising, though, is usually more effective. Anyway, the fraudster masquerades as the executive at this point and sends a request to an employee who handles transfer payments, requesting a wire transfer. And this is where the social engineering component that Lance mentioned comes into play. The message is often sent with a sense of urgency, or possibly while the executive is in travel status, or at the end of the work week. Like Lance said, playing on the emotions. None of us want to disappoint our boss. We all want to get our work week wrapped up successfully, etc. So all too often, the employee believes it is the executive sending the message and executes the transfer. In some instances, the fraudster may attempt to contact the bank directly, but for the most part, they seem to have found that it's much better to simply let the duped employee handle that portion of the fraud, of transferring the money. In the next one, the bogus invoice scheme, an employee in your business has his or her email account hacked, not spoofed in this case. And what happens is the fraudster identifies customers through the employee's contact list and or previous emails that they go through, and then sends bogus invoices to existing customers. And you can probably guess by now that these invoices contain banking information controlled by the fraudsters. Your business will typically not become aware of this fraud until you're contacted by customers who have detected it. I've long suggested that businesses periodically go through and verify recurring invoice payments that they make to make sure they are legitimate. And occasionally, I have had people come back and tell me they were glad that they went through that exercise because they found a couple fraudulent charges that were recurring and that they had paid repeatedly. The next scenario is kind of a little bit newer. It's been around a little bit though. It's called the attorney impersonation scenario, which offers a variation that tends to make it quite effective. It starts very similar to the classic CEO fraud scenario, with a fraudster masquerading as the exec and sending an email about a business matter, which again, as I'm sure you guessed, this business matter is urgent and it's confidential. So we certainly don't want you telling anybody else either. And so this time though, the email advises the employee that an attorney will be in contact with them to facilitate the rest of the request. A plausible story is provided, such as a merger and acquisition. The bogus attorney then contacts the employee, and this part is often via phone with a legitimate sounding speaker, the correct accent, dialect, etc., in order to not raise suspicion in the given fraud. And the details about the fraudulent business transaction are then provided and carried out by the employee. Now this scheme is very effective for a couple different reasons. One, bringing in the attorney into the situation, if it is executed well by the fraudster, tends to add legitimacy to the request. And secondly, when attorneys are involved in a financial transaction, what else does that probably mean? It means that there's going to be large dollar amounts involved. So this story tends to cause some of the largest financial losses that we see. Now, I did mention that there were 4 main categories. I don't have a slide for this next one, but Lance did reference it earlier, and so I was going to briefly mention it as well. There's a 5th scheme we've seen increasingly lately, and in it, an executive sends an email to numerous employees requesting W-2s or personally identifying information from them. And so those employees who send it have then given their PII to a malicious actor who can use it for any number of purposes. But since it is still April and tax season is a recent memory for those of you in the US, tax fraud is one of the most common uses for this information. So this type of message tends to spike at the beginning of tax season, at least here in the U.S., so that fraudsters can file early fraudulent tax returns. And as you might guess, they never seem to owe money to the Treasury. They always get a return. And so that's another scheme that for you to be aware of as well. Now let's talk about who is targeted by these types of frauds. When we first started seeing CEO fraud, I expected that only, or at least mainly, small businesses would fall victim. Large companies seem to be harder targets, after all, with their sophisticated IT controls and perhaps tighter financial procedures. But as it turns out, small businesses are indeed heavily targeted, but large businesses with these sophisticated security programs have been victimized often as well. So they're not immune. In one well-known example, Ubiquiti Networks lost $46.7 million. The toy maker Mattel lost $3 million to BEC. And recently an Austrian aircraft supply company reportedly lost $54 million. So every size of business is vulnerable to this fraud. Now, the specific employees that are targeted, you probably have been able to deduce from the scenarios that we worked through. It tends to be the executives and any employees who make transfer payments as part of their duties, as we discussed in those scenarios. Another point that I would like to make is that when criminals identify an industry they perceive as vulnerable, they will hyper-focus on that industry until it learns its lesson. One example, and I'm not going to say the industry publicly so as to not bring it any additional attention, but we observed a sudden and dramatic increase in attacks against what I would describe as a boutique financial services industry, a very specific niche. And in this industry, very small businesses handled large financial transactions, but they did so in a very loose and informal fashion, which had worked fine for them for many years. Transactions were done primarily through email, often with personal accounts that had no corporate security mechanism behind them, or on home computers, which were used for personal browsing, social media, and so forth, in addition to all of their business transactions. And additionally, these systems obviously weren't subject to any type of rigorous patch management either. So the results were exactly as you might expect, large financial losses. And it became obvious that the criminals were targeting this industry specifically. Fortunately, we identified the trend and we were able to conduct some industry awareness briefings on the issue. And so lately it seems we've begun to receive more calls of detected attempts, that the business identified, rather than huge losses, rather than them reporting being a victim again. So that's a trend, of course, that I like very much. Let's talk about who is behind these frauds. Now, these are not typically conducted by lone actors. While it's relatively easy to understand the fraud as we've discussed it today, and it may not strike you as terribly sophisticated, it does take some organization to carry out effectively, especially at large scale, and to launder them and those types of activities. And as such, it has been substantially linked to organized crime organizations all over the world. FBI investigations have shown some groups use what they call safe houses or boiler rooms to conduct BEC. These groups operate from apartments or hotel rooms, usually renting under fake names, of course. They don't stay in one spot for very long, and they're even willing to move to different countries with some frequency to avoid detection. These boiler rooms will also consist of multiple job roles to pull off the fraud. For example, they'll have maybe a computer expert, a few people who conduct all of this company research that both Lance and I have mentioned, native speakers for the countries that they're targeting, and also a manager overseeing the whole process and directing everybody's activities. Organized crime groups also avail themselves of all the resources in the cyber underground, such as special email clients which monitor hundreds or even thousands of compromised email accounts at once, even with the capability to search for keywords on incoming messages on all of those. Or massive email lists of Fortune 500 executives that they can purchase in these underground forums. Or they can leverage cash-out services and money mule networks that assist with laundering all of the ill-gotten proceeds. Now, moving on to how to protect your organization, I think that both Lance and I are both reasonably positive, upbeat individuals, so I'm ready to switch out of giving you all bad news. I'd like to switch to giving you the good news that these frauds can be drastically reduced by taking a few simple measures. First, use two-step verification to protect email accounts, if at all possible. Now, you may have noticed that I mentioned not every version of every scenario we discussed relies on a compromised email account, but it sure does make the fraudster's job easier. If they are able to send directly from the executive's account, then that's one less indicator of fraud for the other employee to pick up on. Additionally, the fraudster can review previous emails to understand what types of transactions are normal with how this firm conducts business. They're able to mimic the executive's communication style. Maybe they're able to find, maybe the person who handles the wire transfers is named Catherine, but the executive always calls her Kate, or she goes by Kate. They're able to find out that type of information. They can even, of course, use the executive's email signature, number of things that make this much difficult to detect. So in general, compromised email accounts are very, very bad. Take any measures you can in your organization to prevent that from happening. And two factors, one of the better methods out there. Second, improve the business's standard operating procedures for verifying financial transactions. Ideally, you would verify transactions through another band of communication, such as voice calls with the responsible executive. Now, I understand that that may not be practical to do for every transaction, but can you at least consider requiring that second form of communication for transfers over a certain threshold that you determine is appropriate for your business? Something to consider. Also, kind of an obvious one here, be careful about spoofed emails, emails with a different reply to address, those sorts of things. One good way to help identify those for your employees is if your organization is able to flag external emails. Couple that with education of those employees and awareness, and they can possibly identify that a message is a spoofed email and is possibly part of one of these spoofing scenarios. And lastly, raising awareness can go a long way toward mitigating this threat, even more so than many other threats, I would say. Take ransomware, for example. Awareness does help, especially insofar as it underscores the need for good backups, for keeping your systems patched, for not falling for phishing emails, etc. But once infected, the encryption of the files takes place in the background, and there's really not much that the user can do at that point once they become aware of it. On the other hand, BEC requires tricking an employee into taking the proactive step of transferring large sums of money to the fraudster's bank account. And this seems to be a mistake that many organizations, especially small businesses, only make one time, which that tells me awareness can be very effective, all right? The most effective way to become aware is to be a victim and then have a very bad day at your business. However, I would much rather that we develop awareness programs and make people aware of this ahead of time to prevent that. And we have told you the employees to focus your awareness efforts on initially. Executives, ones who are able to make transfer payments, and those that we discussed in the scenarios. So one of the main points that I would like for you to take today is it's very important that you do not just keep the information you learned today or perhaps that you already knew before this to yourself. Spread the word. Be BEC and security awareness evangelists so that we can reduce the impact of this fraud and stop lining the pockets of dangerous organized crime groups. Lastly, I hope that with the information we've provided you today that you won't be victims, but I would briefly like to provide some steps you can take if you are victims or know somebody who is. First, please let your financial institution and law enforcement know, especially if the fraudster provided bank account information in the email you identified. The bank account is the most difficult piece of infrastructure for them to control because, as you know, if you've opened a bank account recently, a lot of positive identification is required to do that. So that is one thing that if we can identify accounts that are used in fraud, it is relatively easy to get those shut down and becomes difficult for them to get new ones. So additionally, if it is a large loss, I'm saying definitely call law enforcement immediately. If you're in the U.S., your local FBI office, elsewhere, the most appropriate authorities for where you are. Time is often of the essence in recovering these funds. We do work closely with banks and also with international law enforcement partners abroad. If we find out about one of these within the first 24 to even 48 hours sometimes, we are often able to recover all or most of the funds. Next, take the time to file an IC3.gov complaint with the Internet Crime Complaint Center. Remember, it serves as one of the best repositories of information for us to help identify investigative targets and spread awareness to the communities in which we work. So if you have time, please do this even if you detect the fraud and there's no loss. And like I said, especially if you have a bank account identified. For those of you elsewhere in the world, take the equivalent steps. So for example, in Europe, visit Europol's site to find out how to file a complaint for your specific location. And I think we've provided a link there with the presentation, but you can also just search for Europol file internet complaint and you'll find out where to do that. So with that, I will turn it back over to Lance.
Okay, Preston, thank you so much. Folks, that was fast and furious. We know that your time is limited, so what we want to do is always pack as much information as possible. Now, I saw we have some questions, and we will be taking questions here, but very briefly, what I just want to do is provide some information where you can learn more. So first of all, Preston has mentioned the FBI report. You can follow the URL right there. We had to shorten it. The actual URL is about, it would have taken up 3 lines long. Then also we have some other resources for you also. We have some upcoming webcasts, Security Awareness Summit. Preston mentioned the need for awareness. We'll learn how to build effective awareness programs at the Awareness Summit and their 2-day Management 433 courses. You can find all of these up on the Securing the Human website at the URL below. So with that said, Carol, back to you. Do we have